Miss Marlin and the Three Murders the Night Before Christmas. Welcome to Warm Pages. I'm Edward. Are you counting the days to the winter holidays, New Year and Christmas? Or do you prefer the easy warmth of summertime? Tell us below, and don't forget to subscribe so our cozy community can keep growing. Now, let's begin tonight's mystery. Chapter 1. Arrival at Greystone Manor. The train rattled through the gathering dusk, and Miss Jane Marple pressed her gloved hand gently against the cold window, watching the countryside grow steadily whiter. Snow had begun to fall in earnest now, soft flakes dancing past the glass like scattered confetti at a particularly subdued wedding. She thought of Mrs. Srees, Briggs from the village, who always said that snow before Christmas meant secrets would be revealed before the new year. Fanciful, of course, but there was often truth in country sayings. The invitation from Colonel Harcourt had come as something of a surprise. They were not intimate friends, merely acquaintances from the garden fete the previous summer, where Miss Marple had admired the roses at Greystone Manor, and mentioned quite casually that she would be spending Christmas alone this year. The Colonel's wife had insisted, with that particular brand of forceful kindness that allowed no refusal, that Miss Marple must come to them. Just a small gathering, Mrs. Marple, Harcourt had written in her flowing script. Nothing elaborate, simply good company, and a peaceful Christmas. As the taxi from the station wound its way up the long drive, Miss Marple observed that Greystone Manor was every inch the proper country house. Built of gray stone that seemed to absorb the failing light, it stood 3 stories tall, with ivy climbing its walls in dark tendrils. Lights glowed warmly from the windows, promising comfort within, though Miss Marple noted with interest that one window on the second floor remained quite dark. Someone, it seemed, had not yet arrived. The front door opened before she could knock, and a nervous-looking maid stood framed in the golden light of the hallway. "Miss Marple, Mom, I'm Elsie. Do come in from the cold." The girl's hands trembled slightly as she took Miss Marple's coat. She was young, perhaps 20, with pale features and red-rimmed eyes that suggested either a recent cold or recent tears. Miss Marple smiled at her kindly. "Thank you, my dear. What dreadful weather for Christmas Eve." "Yes, Mom. They say we'll be snowed in by morning." Elsie's voice dropped to a near whisper. "Some folks say that's unlucky. Now, Elsie, don't go filling our guest head with superstitions." Mrs. Harcourt appeared from a doorway to the right, her silk evening dress rustling as she moved forward with outstretched hands. She was a handsome woman in her late 40s with carefully arranged dark hair and a smile that seemed painted on. "Dear Miss Marple, how delightful that you've arrived safely. The storm is getting quite fierce. So kind of you to have me, Mrs. Harcourt." "Nonsense. The Colonel and I are positively thrilled. Now come, everyone is gathering in the drawing room. Elsie, take Miss Marple's case to the Rose Room." As they walked through the paneled hallway, Miss Marple took note of the house's quiet elegance. Nothing showy, but everything of quality. The sort of home that spoke of old money carefully maintained. Yet there was something in Mrs. Harcourt's manner, a brittleness beneath the polish that reminded Miss Marple of Mrs. Cavendish back home, who had smiled and smiled right up until her husband's business collapsed. The drawing room was magnificent. A fire blazed in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the Persian carpet. A Christmas tree stood in the corner, dressed with modest ornaments and candles not yet lit. 3 people turned as they entered. "Ah, Miss Marple!" Colonel Harcourt came forward, a tall man with military bearing and iron-gray hair. His handshake was firm, but Miss Marple noticed the faint tremor in his fingers. "Nerves, or perhaps something else. Delighted you could join us. May I introduce my brother Edward?" The second man bore a strong family resemblance, but lacked the Colonel's upright posture. Edward Harcourt was softer around the middle, with tired eyes and a weak chin. He bowed slightly. "Miss Marple, charming to meet you. My brother speaks highly of your roses." "How kind." Miss Marple settled into the chair. Mrs. Harcourt indicated, "Have you come far, Mr. Harcourt?" A brief glance passed between the brothers before Edward answered, "From London, rather a last-minute arrangement, actually. Family and all that." The Colonel cleared his throat, a shade too loudly, and gestured toward the third figure. "And this is Mrs. Bay, Selby, who recently returned from abroad." Mrs. Selby was striking rather than beautiful, perhaps 40 years old, dressed in a burgundy gown that suited her dark coloring. She moved with the languid grace of someone accustomed to admiration. But there was a sharpness in her eyes that belied her lazy smile. Miss Marple, how refreshing to have someone sensible join our little party. I was beginning to fear we'd have nothing but politics and hunting talk all evening. Her voice carried the faintest trace of an accent, though Miss Marple could not quite place it. I understand you've been traveling, Mrs. Selby. India mostly. My late husband had business interests there, but one grows weary of the heat and the dust. England at Christmas seemed suddenly appealing. The door opened, and a stocky gentleman in country tweeds entered, carrying a medical bag. "Ah, Dr. March," the colonel said with evident relief. "Managed to get here before the roads became impossible. Only just. The wind is positively savage." Dr. March nodded to Miss Marple with professional courtesy. "You must be our visitor from St. Mary-me. The colonel mentioned you grow remarkable lupins. Delphiniums actually," Miss Marple murmured, though she smiled. It was interesting that the colonel had discussed her at all with the doctor. "You're local, Dr. March. The village?" "Yes. I have known the family for years. The colonel's father delivered me into the world in a manner of speaking." Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Harcourt's expression tighten at those words, and Mrs. Marple, Selby's fingers drummed once sharply against the arm of her chair. Edward Harcourt stared into the fire, his face unreadable. The conversation turned to safer topics, the weather and the approaching holiday, but Miss Marple kept her knitting needles clicking steadily and her eyes watchful. The tension in the room was palpable, like the pressure before a thunderstorm. These people smiled and spoke pleasantries, but they watched one another with barely concealed weariness. It reminded her of the Smithson family tea just before the eldest son announced his father's will had been changed. Everyone had been terribly polite then, too. Outside, the snow fell harder. Through the window, Miss Marple could see the white shrouds spreading across the lawns and drive. By morning, they would indeed be quite cut off from the world. She wondered, not for the first time, why Colonel Harcourt had really invited her to Greystone Manor for Christmas. Chapter 2. An Unwelcome Guest. Dinner was served at 8 in the dining room, a formal affair despite Mrs. Harcourt's assurances of simplicity. The table gleamed with silver and crystal, and Elsie moved nervously between the guests, her hands still prone to that faint trembling Miss Marple had noticed earlier. The soup was excellent, a rich consume, but the conversation remained strained. Colonel Harcourt spoke too heartily about the pheasant shooting, while his brother Edward barely touched his food. Mrs. Selby contributed witty observations about Delhi society that fell rather flat, and Dr. March maintained the determinedly cheerful manner of a man trying to lift spirits at a sickbed. Miss Marple, eating her soup with small, precise movements, observed them all. "More wine, Miss Marple?" The colonel held the decanter poised. "No, thank you, Colonel. I find it makes me quite talkative, and I do prefer to listen." She smiled gently. "One learns so much more that way." Mrs. Harcourt laughed a brutal sound. "How very wise. I'm sure you've encountered all sorts of interesting characters in your village." "Oh yes, human nature is much the same everywhere. I find the same small jealousies, the same little secrets." Edward Harcourt's fork clattered against his plate. "Secrets? What an odd word to choose for Christmas Eve dinner. Is it?" Miss Marple's needles had been left upstairs, but her fingers moved in her lap as if knitting nonetheless. "I was thinking of Mrs. Bartlett in my village. She kept a secret for 30 years about who had really broken the vicar's window. It weighed on her terribly. When it finally came out, she said it was like putting down a heavy case after a long journey." The silence that followed was profound. Dr. March broke it by requesting the salt, but Miss Marple had seen Mrs. Selby's hand tighten on her wineglass, and the colonel's face had gone quite pale. They were midway through the fish course when the doorbell rang. The sound seemed to freeze everyone at the table. Elsie, who had been clearing plates, stopped so abruptly that a fork slid to the floor with a clatter. Who on earth could that be? Mrs. Harcourt's voice was sharp. In this weather, the colonel rose, his napkin falling forgotten to his chair. "I'll see to it." But before he could move, the dining room door opened and a man stepped in, shaking snow from his dark overcoat. He was perhaps 50, lean and pale, with the sort of face that suggested he smiled rarely and meant it never. "Forgive the intrusion." His voice was smooth like oil on water. "The roads are becoming quite impossible. Your maid was kind enough to admit me, Mr. Avery." The colonel's tone was flat. All the forced heartiness drained away. "This is unexpected." "Is it?" The man's eyebrows rose fractionally. "I wrote to inform you I would be calling on Christmas Eve with the papers we discussed. Perhaps the letter went astray in the holiday post." Miss Marple watched Mrs. Harcourt's face. The woman had gone quite white, and her eyes darted to her husband with something very like panic. "There must be some mistake," Mrs. Hark said quickly. "We arranged no such visit. Surely this could wait until after the holiday." "Alas, no." Mr. Avery removed his gloves with deliberate care. "The matter is rather urgent. Legal documents, you understand, require the Colonel's signature tonight." Edward Harcourt pushed back from the table. "Leonard." The single word carried weight and something else. Recognition, certainly, but also distaste. So they knew each other, Miss Marple thought. How interesting that Edward had not mentioned it. "Edward is still lingering in your brother's shadow, I see." Avery's smile was unpleasant. "Dr. March, Mrs. Selby, what a cozy gathering this is. Quite the reunion." Mrs. Selby had frozen with a wineglass halfway to her lips. She set it down with exaggerated care. "Mr. Avery, I'd not realized you were acquainted with the Colonel." "Oh, we're all acquainted in one way or another, aren't we? Old times, old connections." His gaze swept the table and lingered on Miss Marple. "And you are Miss Marple. Merely a guest. How fortunate for you." Something in his tone suggested he did not think her fortunate at all. Colonel Harcourt seemed to collect himself. "Well, since you're here, we might as well conclude this business. My study, I think, if you'll all excuse us." "Actually," Avery said, pulling out the empty chair beside Edward, "I haven't dined yet, and I find business settles better on a full stomach. You don't mind, Mrs. Harcourt." What could she say? Miss Marple watched the woman struggle between social obligation and clear desire to refuse, breeding one, as it generally did. Of course not, Elsie, another place setting. The remainder of the meal was agony thinly disguised as civility. Mr. Avery ate with evident enjoyment, making small comments that seemed innocent enough but left awkward silences in their wake. He mentioned Kolkata, and Mrs. Selby nearly choked on her wine. He spoke of a bank in London, and Edward excused himself briefly, returning with a handkerchief pressed to his forehead. Miss Marple noticed everything. She noticed that Dr. Tooty, March would not meet Avery's eyes. She noticed Mrs. Harcourt's hand shaking as she rang for dessert. She noticed the Colonel's signature tremor had grown more pronounced. Most of all, she noticed that when Avery smiled at his hosts, it was the smile of a man holding all the cards in a very high-stakes game. After dinner, the Colonel and Avery retired to the study. The door closed with a definitive click, and the remaining guests drifted to the drawing room with the relieved air of prisoners granted temporary reprieve. "Dreadful man," Mrs. Brandon, Selby murmured, arranging herself on the sofa. "Who is he exactly?" "A solicitor," Edward said shortly. "And other things, Edward?" Dr. March's tone carried a warning. Miss Marple settled into her chair by the fire, her knitting emerging from her bag. "He seems to know you all quite well." "Long legal circles are small," Dr. March said too quickly. "One encounters the same people repeatedly." "Of course," Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Rather a village, I suppose. Everyone knows everyone else's business, sometimes knowing things they'd rather forget." Mrs. Selby rose abruptly. "I think I shall retire. The journey has quite exhausted me." She swept from the room, and Miss Marple observed that Edward's gaze followed her, his expression troubled. Through the door of the study came the murmur of voices too low to distinguish words, then a sudden, sharp sound like a hand striking wood. The Colonel's voice rose briefly before dropping again to an angry whisper. "This is intolerable," Mrs. Harcourt said to no one in particular. She stood by the window, staring out at the snow that now fell in thick curtains. "We're completely cut off. The telephone lines will be down by morning." Miss Marple thought of the fairy tale, the one about being locked in the castle with the wolf already inside. She kept knitting, her fingers steady, her mind working through the threads of connection she could already see forming. Whatever business Mr. Leonard Avery had with Colonel Harcourt, it was business that touched them all. And none of them, she thought, was pleased to see him here. The fire crackled outside. The wind howled around the corners of Greystone Manor, and the snow continued to fall. Chapter 3. Secrets by the firelight. The study door opened at 9, and Colonel Harcourt emerged looking 10 years older than when he had entered. His face was gray, and that tremor in his hands had become pronounced enough that he thrust them into his pockets. Mr. Avery followed, tucking a folded document into his breast pocket with a satisfied air of a cat that had cornered a mouse. "All settled, then." Avery announced to the room at large. "The Colonel has been most cooperative." Mrs. Harcourt rose from her chair, her knuckles white where they gripped the armrest. "Surely you'll be leaving now, Mr. Avery, before the roads become completely impossible." "Too late for that, I'm afraid." He moved to the window and drew back the curtain. The world beyond was nothing but swirling white. "I took the liberty of asking your maid to prepare a room. I trust that's not inconvenient." The word hung in the air like a challenge. Everyone knew it was deeply inconvenient. Everyone also knew there was nothing to be done about it. "Of course not," the Colonel said heavily. "We could hardly turn you out into a blizzard. Christian charity and all that. How kind." Avery's smile suggested he found the concept of Christian charity amusing. "Then perhaps we might all enjoy a civilized evening together. Some music, perhaps." "I see you have a gramophone." Miss Marple had returned to her knitting, but her eyes moved from face to face with the quick, bright attention of a bird watching for crumbs. She had seen this pattern before in the village: the creditor who smiled too much, the blackmailer who spoke of charity. Mr. Avery reminded her forcibly of Mr. Dance, Raffles, who had held a farmer's debt over him until the poor man had collapsed in the street. Mrs. Selby had returned to the drawing room, changed into a different gown, her composure carefully reconstructed. She accepted a glass of cherry from Dr. March without looking at Mr. Avery at all, which was in itself revealing. People only worked that hard to ignore someone who mattered very much. Music would be delightful, Mrs. Selby said. Something seasonal, perhaps. Edward moved to the gramophone and sorted through the records with fumbling fingers. He selected something, and soon the room filled with the gentle strains of a carol. "God rest your merry gentlemen." Rather ironic under the circumstances, they arranged themselves around the fire with studied casualness, each finding a position that allowed them to avoid sitting too close to Mr. Avery. He seemed to find this amusing and settled himself in the best chair with the sherry. The picture of a man entirely at ease. "This reminds me of Christmas in '98, he said pleasantly. "Do you remember, Edward? That house party at Lord Wickham's estate?" Edward's hand jerked, spilling a few drops of cherry on his trousers. "I don't recall." "Really? I remember it vividly. You and the Colonel both attended, and Dr. March, if memory serves. Quite the merry gathering until that unfortunate business with the cards." Dr. March sat down his glass with a sharp click. "Ancient history, Avery. Is it? I find the past has a way of remaining rather present, particularly when certain details were never fully resolved." Miss Marple's needles continued their steady rhythm. She appeared absorbed in her work, but she had caught the quick glance between the Colonel and his brother, and the way Mrs. Harcourt had gone very still. "You must have a remarkable memory, Mr. Avery," Miss Marple observed mildly, "to recall a house party from so long ago." "I make it my business to remember important things, Miss Marple. Details that others might prefer forgotten." "How exhausting that must be." "I find it difficult enough remembering where I've put my spectacles." "The past is such a burden if one carries too much of it." Something flickered in Avery's expression, but he merely raised his glass in a small salute. The gramophone record ended, and in the silence that followed, Mrs. Motley Selby rose and moved to the Christmas tree. "We should light the candles. It seems a shame to have such a lovely tree and leave it dark." "Tomorrow," Mrs. Harcourt said quickly. "Christmas Day would be more appropriate. Why wait?" Mrs. Selby's voice was light, but there was an edge to it. She produced matches from her box on the mantel and began lighting the small candles nestled among the branches. The flames caught and held, casting dancing shadows across the room. It was then that Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Selby slip something small and white from her sleeve, a note folded small. As she moved around the tree, she brushed past Edward, and the paper disappeared into his hand with a practiced ease that spoke of prior arrangement. Edward's face remained impassive, but his fingers closed tightly around the note. A moment later, he excused himself with a mumble about needing air and left the room. "Careful with those candles, Mrs. Pastive." "Selby," Dr. March said. "Fire is a dangerous thing in an old house. Everything is dangerous if one thinks about it too much." Mrs. Selby returned to her seat, her task complete. "Life itself is rather risky, wouldn't you say?" The conversation meandered on, touching on safe topics like the weather in London theatre and the prospects for next year's roses. But beneath the words, Miss Marple sensed currents of fear and anger and something else. Desperation, perhaps. It was nearly 11 when Elsie appeared with a tray of tea things. Her eyes were red-rimmed again, and her hands shook so badly that the cups rattled in their saucers. "Steady on, girl," the Colonel said not unkindly. Elsie set the tray down and turned to leave. But as she did, Mr. Avery spoke. "Tell me, Elsie, have you been in service here long?" The girl froze. 2 years, sir. And before that, I was with Mrs. Selby, sir, in India." "Miss Marple saw Mrs. Selby, sir, in India." Selby's expression hardened just for an instant before smoothing back into careful neutrality. "How interesting," Avery continued. "You must have seen quite a lot in India. I understand it was a very eventful time for Mrs. Selby's household." "That's quite enough." Mrs. Selby's voice was sharp as broken glass. "Leave the girl alone." Elsie fled, and the tray she'd been holding clattered to the floor in the hallway. The sound of her running footsteps echoed through the house. "Really, Avery?" Dr. March said heavily. "Must you terrorize the servants? I merely asked a question. If the girl is frightened, perhaps she has reason to be." Mrs. Harcourt stood abruptly. "I think we should all retire. It's been a long and trying day." There were murmurs of agreement, though Miss Marple noted that no one seemed eager to leave the safety of the lighted room. Eventually, however, the gathering broke up, and the guests made their way toward the stairs. Miss Marple lingered, ostensibly to collect her knitting bag. In truth, she wanted a moment to observe the room now that it was empty. The fire had burned low, casting the corners into shadow. The Christmas tree candles had been snuffed, leaving the faint scent of wax in the air. Something white caught her eye. There beneath the rug near where Edward had been standing, Miss Marple bent and retrieved it with her knitting needle. It was the note Mrs. Selby had passed to Edward. He must have dropped it in his haste to leave. The paper was fine quality, and the handwriting was an elegant slant. "He knows to destroy it before morning." Miss Marple read the words twice, then carefully folded the note and placed it in her knitting bag. She had no intention of destroying anything. In her experience, it was always better to know what people were desperate to hide. As she made her way upstairs, she heard voices from the Colonel's study, low, urgent, angry, and then a laugh from Mr. Avery, cold and triumphant. Miss Marple went to her room and locked the door. Outside, the snow continued to fall, sealing them all inside Greystone Manor with their secrets and their fears, and with whatever terrible thing would happen before morning. Chapter 4. The First Death. Miss Marple had just turned down the coverlet on her bed when the scream tore through the house. It was a woman's scream, high and sharp, cutting through the quiet like a knife through silk. Miss Marple moved with surprising speed for a woman of her years, snatching up her shawl and hurrying to the door. The hallway was already filled with people. Mrs. Marple Harcourt emerged from her room in a dressing gown, her face pale without its careful powder. Dr. March appeared at the top of the stairs, still fully dressed. Edward came from the opposite end of the corridor, and Mrs. Selby stood in her doorway, one hand pressed to her throat. "What on earth?" Colonel Harcourt's voice boomed from below. "Who screamed?" "It was Elsie, sir." The maid stood at the foot of the stairs, trembling violently. "In the study, sir." "Mr. Avery." "He's... Oh, sir, I think he's dead." They descended in a confused rush, propriety forgotten. The study door stood open, lamplight spilling into the dark hallway. Miss Marple followed at a more measured pace, her sharp eyes taking in details. The corridor was cold. Someone had left a window open somewhere. Mr. Leonard Avery sat in the Colonel's leather chair behind the desk, slumped forward with his head resting on his arms. For a moment he might have been sleeping, except that sleeping men do not have that peculiar stillness, that absolute absence of breath. Dr. March pushed through to the desk and checked for a pulse at Avery's neck. His face was grim as he straightened. "Dead. It has been for perhaps 20 minutes, I should think." "But how?" "Mrs. Harcourt's voice was faint. "What happened to him?" "Heart failure, most likely." Dr. March loosened Avery's collar and examined him with professional efficiency. "He's still warm. The body hasn't begun to stiffen." "The door was locked," Elsie whispered. "From the inside, sir. I heard a sound like something falling and I knocked, but there was no answer, so I fetched the Colonel and he had to use his key." Miss Marple moved closer, though she took care not to disturb anything. The room smelled of cigars and brandy and something else. Something faintly bitter that reminded her of the almonds Mrs. Crouch used in her Christmas cake. "Locked from the inside, you say?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "Yes, Mom." The Colonel held up a key. "My study has only 2 keys. I carry one and the other hangs in the kitchen. Both were accounted for. The key was in the lock on the inside when I opened the door." "How very curious." Miss Marple observed the desk with interest. A glass of brandy stood near Avery's right hand, still half full. Papers were scattered across the blot, and she recognized the document that Avery had made the colonel sign earlier. The wax seal had been broken, and the papers lay open. Dr. March was examining Avery's face more closely now using his pocket torch. Curious. The color of his lips is somewhat unusual, and there's a faint discoloration around the mouth. What does that mean? Edward's voice was hoarse. I'm not certain yet. Dr. March straightened his troubled expression. Colonel, I think we should send it to the police. In this weather, it is impossible. The roads won't be passable until the storm breaks. Nevertheless, I must be frank with you all. Dr. March looked around at the assembled faces. I suspect Mr. Avery did not die of natural causes. The symptoms suggest poison. The word fell into the silence like a stone into still water. Mrs. Selby swayed slightly and Edward moved to steady her. Mrs. Harcourt made a small choked sound. Poison. The colonel's face had gone the color of old parchment. That's impossible. How could the brandy? Miss Marple spoke quietly, but everyone turned to look at her. I wonder if anyone saw him pour it. I did, Mom. Elsie's voice was barely audible. He came in here after everyone went upstairs. I was in the hall tidying, and I saw him through the door before he closed it. He poured himself a drink from the decanter there on the sideboard. And you saw no one else enter? No, Mom. The door closed and I heard the key turn. I went about my duties in the other rooms. Then perhaps 15 minutes later, I heard that sound like a book falling, and I came to check. Miss Marple moved to the sideboard. The crystal decanter stood there, still stocked, the brandy within glowing amber in the lamplight. 3 glasses sat beside it, all clean. May I? She looked at Dr. March, who nodded carefully. Using her handkerchief, Miss Marple lifted the glass from the desk and brought it to her nose. She did not drink, merely inhaled gently. Yes, there it was, that bitter almond scent, faint but unmistakable beneath the brandy. Cyanide, I should think, she said calmly. Rather a classic choice. Bitter almonds are quite distinctive once one knows what to look for. Dr. March took the glass from her and sniffed it himself. His face grew even more grave. You're quite right, Miss Marple. I should have recognized it immediately. The discoloration, the rapidity of death, all consistent with cyanide poisoning, but the door was locked. Mrs. Harcourt seemed unable to move past this point. From the inside, how could anyone have poisoned him? The brandy was already poisoned, Edward said slowly before he poured it. It must have been. Dr. Marchand stopped the decanter and smelled it carefully. No, the brandy itself is untainted. Only the glass held poison. Then someone entered after he poured his drink and before the door was locked. Miss Marple suggested or the poison was introduced in some other fashion. But Elsie saw him lock the door himself. Colonel Harcourt ran a hand to his hair, disheveling it. And the windows were all secured from the inside. I checked them myself this evening after Avery arrived. I always check the study windows before retiring. Miss Marple moved to examine the windows. Heavy curtains covered them, and when she drew one back, she found the sash window firmly latched. Snow had drifted against the outside of the glass, undisturbed. No one had opened this window from outside. Perhaps, she said thoughtfully, the poison was in the glass before he poured the brandy. Someone might have prepared it earlier. But who? Mrs. Selby's voice was thin. And why? Miss Marple turned to look at the assembled company. 5 people, not counting herself and the unfortunate maid. 5 people who had all shown discomfort at Avery's presence. 5 people who might have had reason to want him dead. That, she said gently, is what we must discover. Dr. March, I think you're quite right that the police should be informed as soon as possible, but until the road's clear, we are rather on our own. This is preposterous. The colonel's voice shook. A man died in my study on Christmas Eve. We must maintain some sense of order. No one is to touch anything in this room. We'll lock it again and wait for the authorities. A wise precaution, Miss Marple agreed. Though I wonder if we might examine the document Mr. Avery had with him. It may be relevant. The colonel hesitated, then nodded. Miss Marple bent over the papers, reading quickly. It was a legal document, dense with language, but the essence was clear enough. A confession of embezzlement signed by Colonel Harcourt dated that very evening. She said nothing, merely straightened and stepped back. There, Chapter 5, The Second Knock. Miss Marple did not attempt sleep. She sat in the chair by her window, her knitting in her lap, watching the snowfall in the darkness. The house had settled into an uneasy quiet after the horror in the study, but she knew that behind closed doors no one was resting peacefully. The clock in the hall struck 11, then half past. Miss Marple's fingers moved steadily, creating patterns from chaos, order from disorder. It was what she did best. She was thinking about the locked room. In her experience, locked rooms were rarely as mysterious as they first appeared. Either the lock was picked, or the room was locked after the murder, or the murderer had never left at all. But the study had been thoroughly examined. No one had been hiding there, which left the question of the poisoned glass. Someone had introduced cyanide into that brandy after Avery poured it, or the glass itself had been prepared beforehand. But who had access to the study, and who possesses cyanide? The answer to the second question was troublingly simple. Dr. March would certainly have access to poisons through his medical practice, but could the doctor have prepared the glass before Avery entered? And how would he know which glass Avery would choose? Miss Marple's needles paused, unless the glasses themselves were irrelevant, unless the poison had been administered in some other way entirely. She was still pondering this when she heard it, a cry from somewhere below, sharp and sudden, followed by a heavy thud. Miss Marple set aside her knitting and opened her door. The hallway was dark, but she could see light spilling from the servants' staircase at the far end. She moved toward it quickly, her soft slippers making no sound on the carpet. Dr. Tremaine, March reached the staircase first, still dressed, a lamp in his hand. The colonel appeared behind him, hastily belting his dressing gown. By the time Mrs. Marple arrived, Harcourt and Edward were also descending from their rooms. At the foot of the servants' stairs lay Elsie. The maid was crumpled at an unnatural angle, her neck bent, one arm flung out as if reaching for something that wasn't there. Her eyes stared at nothing and a small trickle of blood ran from the corner of her mouth. Dear God. The colonel's voice was hollow. Not another. Doctor? March knelt beside the body, but Miss Marple could see from his expression that there was no hope. He confirmed it a moment later, looking up with a grim face. Her neck is broken. She must have fallen from the top of the stairs. Mrs. Harcourt pressed a hand to her mouth. The poor child. She was so frightened tonight, so nervous. She must have tripped in the dark. Perhaps. Dr. Harcourt. March's tone suggested doubt. Miss Marple looked up the narrow staircase. It was steep. Certainly the kind of stairs that servants had climbed for generations in houses like this. At the top, a small landing gave access to the servants' quarters. May I? She looked at the colonel, who nodded wearily. Miss Marple climbed the stairs carefully, holding the banister. The wood was smooth and well maintained. At the top, she examined the landing. It was perhaps 4 feet square, with doors leading off to the maids' rooms and the back stairs that descended to the kitchen. She looked for a candle, a lamp, anything that might have been knocked over in a fall. There was nothing. The landing was bare except for a small table against the wall, and on it sat an unlit oil lamp untouched. Miss Marple descended slowly, her mind working. Dr. March, she said quietly, might I trouble you to examine the body more carefully? He looked at her sharply, then bent again to his task. His hands moved over Elsie's arms and shoulders, then paused. There are bruises here on her upper arms. Recent bruises made within the last hour, the kind one might get from being grasped forcefully. Yes, his voice was heavy. Exactly that kind. The implications settled over them like the falling snow. Elsie had not fallen, she had been pushed. But why? Edward's face was ashen. Why would anyone harm the girl? Miss Marple thought of the note she'd found, the one Mrs. Selby had passed to Edward. He knows. Destroy it before morning. And she thought of Elsie's reaction at dinner when Mr. Avery had questioned her about her time in India with Mrs. Selby. I rather think, Miss Marple said gently, that Elsie knew something someone did not want revealed. Mrs. Selby had been standing in the shadows, but now she stepped forward into the lamplight. Her face was carefully composed, but Miss Marple noticed her hands were clenched at her sides. What could a maid possibly know that would matter? A great many things, Mrs. Selby. Servants see everything. They're rather like furniture in that respect. People forget they're there and speak freely. Elsie served in your household in India. She would have known your affairs quite intimately. That's absurd. But Mrs. Selby's voice lacked conviction. Where was everyone when Elsie fell? Dr. March looked around at the assembled group. "In my room," the colonel said, reading. "I was in bed," Mrs. Harkle added quickly. Edward rubbed his face. "I was at my window watching the snow." "And you, Mrs. Selby?" Miss Marple's voice was mild. "In my room, alone, as we all were, presumably, not quite all." Miss Marple looked at Dr. March. "You were dressed, doctor. Have you not yet retired?" "I was reading medical journals in the library. I find them help me settle after unpleasant events. The library is on this floor." Miss Marple glanced around. "You would have been close to the servants' staircase. Are you suggesting I push that girl to her death?" Dr. March's voice was controlled but angry. "I'm a physician. I save lives. I suggest nothing, doctor. I merely observe." Miss Marple moved closer to where Elsie lay. "May I examine her hands?" "Doctor." March stepped back, and Miss Marple knelt with some difficulty beside the body. Elsie's right hand was clenched, and when Miss Marple gently opened the fingers, something small and white fell out, a scrap of paper torn raggedly with 3 words visible in an elegant slant. "Before morning, destroy." It was a piece of the note Miss Marple had found earlier, which meant Elsie must have retrieved it or found it somehow. "What is that?" The colonel bent to look. "A fragment of a note," Miss Marple said. "I believe Elsie found it and confronted someone about its contents. That person could not afford to let her speak." "But we don't even know what the note said." Edward's voice was too loud. Miss Marple looked at him steadily. "Don't we, Mr. Harcourt?" he pleaded, but said nothing. "This is intolerable." The colonel's voice shook. 2 deaths in 1 night. We must lock ourselves in our rooms. No one is to leave until morning. No one is to be alone with anyone else." "A sensible precaution," Miss Marple agreed, "though I fear the damage has already been done." "Dr. March, what should be done with poor Elsie?" "She should be moved somewhere cool. The study is locked, but perhaps the morning room. We cannot leave her here." The colonel and Dr. March carried the body between them, and Mrs. Harcourt fetched a sheet to cover it. The small procession was grim and silent. When Elsie was laid out in the morning room and the door closed, they stood in the hallway, looking at one another with new suspicion. Someone among them was a killer. Someone who had poisoned Mr. Dia. Avery murdered poor Elsie to keep her silent. "To your rooms," the colonel said. "Lock your doors. Stay there until daylight." They dispersed slowly, each watching the others. Miss Marple climbed the stairs last, pausing to look back at the now empty hallway. 2 dead in 1 night, and she suspected with a cold certainty that the killer was not yet finished. The note had said, "Before morning, Chapter 6. The locked room at midnight." Miss Marple sat in the darkness of her room, her hands still at last, her mind racing. The house had fallen into a silence that felt less like peace and more like the held breath before a scream. She thought about patterns. In St. Man, Marry Me, she had learned that human nature repeated itself endlessly. The same jealousies, the same fears, the same desperate acts born of cornered panic. Mr. Avery had been a blackmailer. She was certain of it now. The way he had smiled, the way he had spoken of the past, the document he had forced the colonel to sign, all the hallmarks of a man who traded in secrets, and Elsie, poor frightened Elsie, who had served Mrs. Selby in India and recognized Mr. Avery, who had clutched that scrap of paper in her dying hand. What had she known? What had she threatened to reveal? The clock struck midnight. 3 soft chimes that seemed to echo through the house like a warning. Miss Marple rose and moved her window. The snow had lessened, falling now in soft, lazy flakes rather than the earlier blizzard. The grounds of Greystone Manor lay white and pristine under the faint light of a cloud-shrouded moon. And then she saw it, a light moving. It was faint, barely more than a glimmer, passing from left to right across her field of vision. Miss Marple pressed closer to the cold glass. The light was coming from the ground floor, she thought, moving from the direction of the study toward the drawing room. Someone was awake. Someone was moving through the house. Miss Marple did not hesitate. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, picked up the small oil lamp from her bedside table, and quietly unlocked her door. The hallway was dark and cold. She could hear faint snoring from one of the rooms. The colonel, most likely, but otherwise silence. She moved carefully toward the stairs, her lamp held low, one hand trailing along the wall for balance. The stairs creaked softly under her weight, but she descended slowly, pausing on each step to listen. At the bottom, she could see a faint glow coming from beneath the drawing room door. Miss Marple approached cautiously. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap she could see the flicker of candlelight. She heard a soft sound, like drawers being opened and closed, papers being shuffled. She pushed the door open. Mrs. Selby stood by the writing desk, a candle in one hand, rifling through the contents of a drawer with the other. She froze when she saw Miss Marple, her face pale in the wavering light. "Miss Marple?" Her voice was carefully controlled. "You startled me. Forgive me. I saw a light and thought perhaps someone was unwell." Miss Marple entered the room, her eyes taking in every detail. "You could not sleep either?" "No." Mrs. Selby closed the drawer slowly. "The events of the evening have been rather disturbing." "Indeed. What are you looking for?" The direct question hung in the air. Mrs. Selby's jaw tightened. "Nothing. I merely thought I had left my handkerchief here earlier." In the writing desk, Miss Marple's tone was mild. "How curious. I'm not accustomed to being questioned like a criminal, Miss Marple." "Of course not. Though I confess I'm rather curious about several things. The note you passed to Edward at the Christmas tree, for instance, and what else he might have known about your time in India." Mrs. Selby's hand trembled and hot wax dripped onto the carpet. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do. Mr. Avery was blackmailing you, wasn't he? And the Colonel as well. Something that happened long ago. Something you all wish to keep buried." For a long moment, Mrs. Selby said nothing. Then her shoulders sagged slightly. "You're very perceptive for a village spinster. Village life teaches one a great deal about human nature." Mrs. Selby moved to the sofa and sat, setting the candle on the side table. In the soft light, she looked older, the careful polish worn away by exhaustion and fear. "Yes, Avery was blackmailing me. He had been for years. That's why I returned to England. I could no longer afford to pay him." "And what was he blackmailing you about?" "My husband's death in India." Mrs. Selby's voice was flat. "It was ruled an accident, a fall from a balcony during a party. But Avery knew the truth. He knew I had pushed him." Miss Marple sat down across from her. "Why?" "Because he was a brute who beat me and threatened to cut me off without a penny if I left him. Because I was young and foolish and desperate because I wanted to be free." She looked at Miss Marple with haunted eyes. "Does that shock you?" "Very little shocks me anymore, Mrs. Selby. But I confess I'm puzzled. If you killed your husband and Avery knew it, why did you kill Avery now? Surely that would only increase suspicion." "I didn't kill him." The words came out fierce and desperate. "I swear to you, Miss Marple, I wanted him dead. God help me. I wished him dead 1,000 times, but I didn't poison him." "Then who did?" "I don't know." Mrs. Selby twisted her hands in her lap. "But I think it had more to do with the Colonel than with me. That document Avery made him sign. I saw it in the study. A confession of embezzlement. You were in the study after Mr. Avery died." Mrs. Selby hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, after everyone went upstairs. I needed to see that document. I needed to know if it mentioned me, and the door was locked. I have a key. I took it from the kitchen earlier this evening. I knew Avery would have the document, and I needed to see it." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Tell me exactly what you saw." Avery was already dead, slumped at the desk. I nearly screamed, but I stopped myself. The document was there, open. I read it quickly. It was only about the Colonel, nothing about me. I relocked the door and returned the key to the kitchen. Then I heard Elsie scream and everyone came running. "So, you were the first to discover the body?" "Yes. But I didn't kill him, Miss Marple. I swear it." Miss Marple studied her carefully. The woman was terrified but seemed to be telling the truth, or at least a version of it. "And what were you looking for just now on the writing desk?" "The note. The one I gave Edward. He told me he had lost it, and I was frantic. If anyone found it, if they understood what it meant." She trailed off. "It's too late for that, I'm afraid. Elsie found it. That's what she was holding when she died." Mrs. Selby went very pale. "Then she knew. She knew about India, about my husband. She was going to tell me. Did you push her down the stairs?" "No." The word came out as a snob. "I wanted to. I thought about it, but I couldn't. I'm not a murderer, Miss Marple. Not really. What happened in India was madness, desperation. I couldn't do it again." Miss Marple rose and walked to the window. She drew back the curtain and looked out at the snow-covered grounds. The window was slightly ajar, just an inch, and cold air seeped through the gap. Fresh snow had blown onto the sill, creating a small drift, and there, beside the snow, lay a single glove, a man's glove made of fine leather. Miss Marple picked it up carefully. Mrs. Marple picked it up carefully. Selby, was this window open when you entered the room? I don't know. I didn't notice. Miss Marple examined the glove. It was damp with melted snow on one side, dry on the other, recently dropped, then within the last few minutes. Someone else had been here. Someone who had perhaps stood outside the window listening. Someone who had dropped a glove in their haste to leave. Mrs. Selby, Miss Marple said quietly, I think you should return to your room now, and I think you should lock your door very securely. Why? What does it mean? It means, Miss Marple said, that someone is still moving through this house. Someone who wants very much to ensure certain secrets remain buried. Mrs. Selby fled, her candle flickering wildly. Miss Marple remained at the window, holding the glove, staring out at the snow. 3 deaths, the outline had promised. 2 were already dead. Before morning, there would be 1 more. Chapter 7. Snow on the window ledge. Miss Marple did not return to her room. Instead, she settled into the chair by the drawing room fire, which still held a few glowing embers, and waited for morning. The glove lay in her lap, and she studied it carefully in the lamplight. It was expensive, well-made, the kind a gentleman would wear, and it bore the faint scent of cigars. The Colonel smoked cigars, so had Mr. Avery. But Dr. March and Edward did not, as far as she had observed. She thought about the window, open just that crucial inch, about the snow on the sill, about someone standing outside in the bitter cold, listening to her conversation with Mrs. Pound, Selby, listening to a confession of murder in India. The sky began to lighten, that peculiar gray blue of winter dawn. The storm had passed entirely now, leaving the world crystalline and silent under its blanket of white. Miss Marple heard movement upstairs, footsteps crossing a floor, water running. The house was waking to Christmas morning, though there would be no joy in this dawn. She rose and moved quietly to the hallway. Dr. March was descending the stairs, already dressed, his medical bag in hand. He stopped when he saw her. Miss Marple, have you been up all night? I find sleep rather elusive after such events, doctor. I trust you rested. Not well. He looked haggarded, older than he had the previous day. I thought I should check on Mr. Avery and the girl to ensure nothing has been disturbed. Very professional of you. I wonder, doctor, are these your gloves? She held out the leather glove. Dr. March looked at it, then at his own hands, which were bare. No, mine are upstairs. Why do you ask? I found this by the drawing room window. Someone dropped it there during the night. The Colonel, perhaps? Or Edward? Perhaps. Miss Marple tucked the glove into her shawl pocket. Tell me, doctor, how long have you known the Harcourt family? All my life I grew up in the village. The old Colonel, the current Colonel's father, was a patient of my father's practice. I inherited many of the family connections. Then you would know about any difficulties the family might have faced. Financial troubles, for instance. Dr. March's expression grew guarded. I'm not at liberty to discuss my patient's private affairs, not even when those affairs might involve embezzlement and blackmail. He was silent for a long moment. Then he sighed heavily. You're very astute, Miss Marple. Yes, I knew about the Colonel's difficulties. He came to me in confidence some years ago, distraught. He had made poor investments and borrowed against them. When the investments failed, he took money from the regimental funds to cover his debts, intending to replace it before anyone noticed. But someone did not. Avery noticed. Avery always noticed such things. He was the sort of man who collected secrets like other men collect stamps, and he's been blackmailing the Colonel ever since. Yes, it nearly bankrupted the family. Mrs. Harcourt knows nothing of it. The Colonel has been selling off property, letting staff go, anything to meet Avery's demands. Miss Marple nodded slowly. That explains the document. Avery wanted a written confession, something to hold over the Colonel more completely. A final turn of the screw. Dr. March's voice was bitter. Avery was an evil man, Miss Marple. I won't pretend to mourn him. Did you kill him? The question was asked gently, but it hung in the air like the sword of Damocles. Dr. March met her eyes steadily. No, though I confess I thought about it many times, but I'm a physician. I spent my life preserving life, not taking it. Cyanide would have been readily available to you. Yes, I keep a small supply for medicinal purposes properly secured, but I assure you, Miss Marple, my supply is intact. You may check if you wish." Before Miss Marple could respond, a cry echoed through the house. Not a scream this time, but a shout of alarm. The colonel's voice called for help. They hurried toward the sound. Dr. Doc marched, taking the stairs 2 at a time. Miss Marple followed as quickly as she could, her heart pounding. The colonel stood in the doorway of Edward's room, his face ashen. "He won't wake. Edward won't wake." Dr. March pushed past him into the room. Edward lay in his bed, the covers pulled up to his.